I am so conservative.
Rationalize in my head. These are things I read.
And I'm going to talk about Willow Creek.
Okay.
Willow Creek, a few years back, had
I remembered at the time when Will Rogers said, I don't belong to any organized religion. I'm a Baptist.
Yeah. I am so conservative. If you didn't jump to conclusions, you might not get any exercise. I am so conservative. Welcome to the Unknown Webcast. And yes, I tried to explain to today's guest that it is really true. I am so conservative, I can't turn left even when I'm driving. So this is a trigger warning for those who are new to this webcast. They should be aware this is not a safe space if you are easily offended by having your ideas challenged or perhaps by our satire. Today is November 26, 2019, and this is broadcast number 168. This week, apologist and homeschooling theoretical chemist, Dr. Neil Shenvi, joins us to talk about critical theory and Christianity. My name is Don Vino. I'm president of Midwest Christian Outreach, Inc. in Wonder Lake, Illinois, which produces the Unknown Webcast. And our senior researcher is Ron Hensel, who will introduce the sponsors of today's webcast. And here is Ronnie, baby.
Hey, Neil, if you're a homeschooling theoretical chemist, does this mean that you teach your kids theoretical chemistry? Is that what you do?
In theory.
In theory. Okay, there you go. All right. Well, greetings from sunny Florida, where the palm trees came out, saw their shadows, and now we have 12 more months of summer. Our sole sponsor for this program is a special edition of the Unknown Webcast. So we have one sponsor, Where's the Outrage? The game where the woke shall inherit the earth, unless, of course, they're white males. And if you enjoy this webcast, or if it really annoys you and you want to inflict it on other people, please go to MidwestOutreach.org, click the yellow donate button, and contribute as you feel led. And don't forget to subscribe to us on YouTube. So, welcome, Neil.
I feel very triggered already.
Are you triggered?
I'm already triggered.
He's triggered.
I'm not a white male, but I'm a male, I guess.
Are you a millennial by any chance?
I don't think. I mean, 79. What would that make me? Gen X, barely.
Yeah, barely. Yeah, you're
the Oregon Trail generation, I think.
I forget. Trail mix generation. Yes.
Trail mix generation.
Yeah.
No, see, I am the crybaby boomer generation.
Yeah, we're in that little slot. Our generations were real. I mean, when we had generations, they lasted a long time, like from 45 to 64. You know, I mean, that was a real. I mean, you guys have these mamby-pamby. You know,
these young generations.
5 years here, 7 years there. Yeah. Okay. Well, anyways, glad to have you.
Good to be here.
I want to start out with this because we're talking about critical theory and Christianity, and he has several great articles on this. But I want to start off with the first one. He starts off this way: the subject of my talk today is whether Christianity and critical theory are compatible. It's a great place to start. To answer that question, we have to start with the historical origins of critical theory. Karl Marx was born in Germany in 1818. After publication of Das Kapital in 1867, Marxism became a major ideology, which was embraced and adopted by the Frankfurt School during the 1930s. In 1973, several members of the Frankfurt School founded Cyberdyne Systems, incorporating Marxist social analysis with cutting-edge research into artificial intelligence. Cyberdyne became the largest supplier of military computer systems. Their Skynet global defense system is scheduled to go online August 4th of 2019. It will become self-aware a few weeks later. In a panic, scientists will pull the plug. Skynet will retaliate, triggering a global nuclear war. In the aftermath of small human resistance movement will fight against the machines led by the revolutionary leader John O'Connor. Wait, hold on, stop. What on earth is happening? What is that all about?
Yeah, I feel like I'm having deja vu. It's almost as
All
Have you
over
heard that
again.
script before?
it almost sounds like a movie
I
plot.
tried to sell that to James Cameron, 20 years ago, but it didn't fly. So I in that talk, I gave that talk at New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary last January. No, last January. And obviously it was a joke, riffing on the Terminator movies. But I think that when you hear Christians talk about critical theory, they can be kind of alarmist, even conspiratorial in how they describe it. Like there's some vast left-wing Marxist conspiracy, like the Hydra. Hydra from the Marvel comic universe now that's infiltrated S.H.I.E.L.D. and they're going to destroy the government and take over the world. And I think I really want to make it clear that while critical theory is a real discipline, and some of its beliefs are, I think, theologically very wrong and very dangerous, we have to treat critical theory calmly, charitably, and rationally, and do our best to read the primary sources. I know, Ron, you said that you've read several dictionaries worth of critical theory terms just to get a handle on what these ideas mean and where they're coming from. That's a good approach to critical theory.
Yeah. Well, how do we do this, Don? Okay, yeah. Here are the books I was talking about.
There you go.
This is the Modern Dictionary of Modern Critical Terms, 1973. This has been around a while. This is more recent, the Bedford Glossary of Critical and Literary Terms. And as I said to you guys earlier, if you think literary means apolitical, guess again. All you got to do is read it. Every other page has Marx, Engels, Foucault, Derrida, and all that. 1998, and this is the Penguin Dictionary of Critical Theory, came out in the year 2000. So yeah, I do this just to make sure that I am using the words the way the proponents of these things, and also because so many people are running around and it's like they came late to the game. They think we're making this stuff up.
Right.
They think this is just something that you right wingers, you conservatives, you knee jerk like reactionaries and conspiratorial theorists. No, this is old news, and I think to some extent the critical theorists take advantage of that ignorance, or let's call it lack of education. Which I was just as guilty of the lack of education as anyone until several years ago when I started educating myself. And it's not hard to educate yourself.
Yeah.
The sources are still in print. Okay.
Yeah. I think one of the points I always make in my talks is that I'm upfront. I'm a political conservative. I don't deny that. I'm not going to hide it. But my objections to critical theory have nothing to do with politics. So you could be as a Christian, I think you should be opposed to the basic principles of critical theory and still be in favor of completely open borders and in favor of universal health care and in favor of bringing back the monarchy. I don't care. My objections are not political. I'm not trying to get you to vote a certain way in 2020 or 2024 or whatever. I'm just trying to show you that as a Christian, if you hold to basic Christian theology, you have to reject the basic assumptions of critical theory, and that's not a political stance. That's not my motive. So I really always emphasize that in my talks that I'm trying to do. I know critical theory is very much a political, or it involves political projects, but it's not my stance on this issue.
Right. So you're saying you can detach critical theory from a political agenda?
No.
No.
What I'm saying is you can detach your objections to critical theory from a political agenda. So, for example, you can be I like to terms of policy rather than labels, but you can say I'm fully in support of universal health care, and yet I completely reject critical theory.
So you're justifying it on a different basis.
Right. I'm objecting on theological grounds, not because I'm saying, I can't be a Republican and believe critical theory. I don't care whether you can be a Republican. I care whether or not you can be a Christian and adopt critical theory. That's what I'm saying.
And I think that's where a lot of the confusion is today, because when and maybe we just should, I don't know, maybe we should just stop using the term social justice. I don't know. But social justice has in this literature, this is simply a representative. This is simply reference work to point you to the actual major works. These are not the major works themselves.
Right.
These are dictionaries and reference books. But there's a vast literature out there which has been using the term social justice in a very specific way.
Right.
But when people today hear it, they think we're talking about just regular justice.
And there's a lot of confusion of terms in this area in general, because critical theorists, or I like to call it contemporary critical theory, because I'll show a slide in a second. But a lot of terms like social justice, racism, white supremacy have been redefined, or oppression. These terms have been consciously redefined by contemporary critical theorists. And because of that, people hear these terms and assume they know what they mean when they actually don't mean that.
Yeah.
They've been redefined. So I think it's very important to, again, be clear on what you mean when you use certain terms. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of times Christians will latch on to terms they hear because they sound hip and cutting edge, and have no idea how they're actually being used.
Yeah, that's important, because so we're going to want you to kind of lay this out, because we just watched, for example, the Southern Baptist leadership come out in support of critical race theory. But what does that mean that they're supporting? Or the Gospel Coalition has been accused of buying into social justice. But what do they mean by that? So what does the terms actually mean, so that we know what we're looking at before? Because I'm watching people all over the internet labeling both groups as now desperately heretical.
Right.
Now, maybe they are, but maybe they're just misinformed or using the wrong definition.
Well, so actually the Resolution 9 on critical race theory and intersectionality that SBC passed did not actually endorse it. What they said is it can, they define, this is important, they defined the terms to mean, they're saying there are certain tools that are being used by these disciplines, and we can use those tools too, but they can be used, they're not all wrong, but you cannot adopt certain other ideas from these disciplines. So I actually supported the resolution because, and I don't think it was quite right. I think they had a few problems, but overall they were trying to distinguish these sort of tools from the ideologies underneath them, which are very dangerous. I said that's a good approach. And you can disagree with whether or not it's possible. I think it is possible, but they're not endorsing these major ideologies. In fact, they explicitly said these cannot be accepted as worldviews. They cannot.
Well, do you understand though? Now, we don't have time to go into whether you can separate the tool from its source, but it's kind of like saying, I can use this. To me, this is the way it comes off. It's like we can use a sonic screwdriver without believing it in a real TARDIS, or a real Doctor Who. So that's just where I come from. But I want to get to your slides as soon as possible.
Sure, yeah. Let me just pull up. This is a good one. Okay.
No, I was gonna make. You talked about, before we get there, we talked about redefinition of terms. Back in the late 80s, early 90s, I worked for a left of center seminary. They didn't consider themselves even liberal. They thought they were moderates. Okay, but they were definitely liberal. When you're at a seminary where one of the professors invokes the names of Marx, Lenin, and Jesus all in the same prayer, you might think there's something liberal going on there. Well, one of the things I discovered, this is prior to 1993. Okay, I worked there through the end of 92. They said that racism, I was hearing this more than 25 years ago. It's impossible for a black person to be a racist because the only people who can be racist are those who are in the ruling class, those who are doing the racial oppression. So I ran home to my dictionaries, and I have a few. I have, I had American Heritage, I had Merriam-Webster, and I forget what others. I looked it up in every dictionary I had. We didn't have the web yet. That definition was not in any dictionary I owned. It was simply the view that one racial group is superior to another. That's been the dictionary definition of racism since the term was invented. I've checked more recent editions of these dictionaries. The ones I've checked, still have not included this alternate definition, which apparently is only being used by, I don't know, left-wing sociologists. Maybe you would know better than I. So this is what we're talking about, right? Changing the meaning of terms so that then we can change the rules so that they can win.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. So and there are many others. So I have a whole series of articles called it's called a Glossary of Anti-Racism. I think Anti-Racist Glossary, where I go through terms like white supremacy, racism, white fragility, white privilege, and explain how they're being defined, and therefore, and where Christians can say, well, this idea, this part of it is okay, but this part of it's not okay. So we have to be careful, again, to be very precise in we don't want to reject everything. For example, simple example, critical race theory, one of its primary tenets is that race is a social construct, meaning that race isn't, as we as Christians would say, race isn't sort of essential, an ontological category. God doesn't view us as black or white. Ethnic groups are real; they're real. Ancestry is real, right? But race is a category. Like, God doesn't view us as like, well, he's a white man, he's a black man. God views us in terms of ethnic groups, ancestry, but not race. Race was constructed in the 1600s for actually pretty bad reasons. But the point is, I think Christians should agree with that. We should say, wow, that's actually very true. But now, just because, so we should accept that singular idea. We shouldn't throw that away. And yet, there are other ideas we would not at all want to accept from critical race theory. So again, I just think we need to have to use a lot of discernment and understand these ideas, and then parse out what is false from what is true. And oftentimes, I got a lot of flack for supporting Resolution 9, and I think the people that were critical of my view had a very reasonable point. They said, you're asking people to sort through and separate truth from error. It's like handing your kids a bag of Halloween candy, but a bunch of Skittles that are 99 pieces of poison in one Skittle, and saying, hey guys, look, I got some Skittles, right? Go ahead, sort through them and figure out which ones are the candy, which ones are the poison. No parent's going to do that. In the same way, are we handing people a bunch of really dangerous ideas and saying there's some truth in there? That's a dangerous, again, that might be true, it is true. But overall, it's a bad strategy, and it's not a prudent strategy. And so I think that's a fair, although I wouldn't necessarily totally agree with that. I'd say it's a fair perspective on this issue. But let me go to the slides then, because I want to.
Yeah, let's do that.
Yeah, let me share the first one.
You gave me a taste of them before the.
There
program,
you go. Yeah.
And now I'm salivating. I'm just salivating.
So here we go. Okay. That's what. There we go. Okay. So here it goes. You have that now.
We're getting it, I'm sure. I see it coming. I see it on its way. There it is.
Okay, so this is the taxonomy, the origin and how these ideas, where they come from, what do they mean? Actually, I'll go back once. This is actually two pages from a book by Simon van Loon. It's a graphical chart of where critical theory comes from and what it means, and who's part of it. And if you look there, it is complicated. It is broad. You have postmodernists like Derrida and Foucault. You have this one box there is all of second wave feminism. That's just one box.
It's kind of like a denominational family tree.
Oh, yeah, right. With even less coherence, because so I'm just pointing out there. You have Karl Marx. You have black feminism. You have post-colonialism. And there were like 20 boxes there, all under the heading of critical theory.
When I see the Frankfurt School, I reach for the ketchup, mustard, and relish.
Yeah, not that kind of, yeah.
Oh, okay.
My point is just this. So to say, well, what is critical theory? Well, it's incredibly broad. It's like asking, what is feminism? You're talking about the suffragists in the early 1900s. You're talking about second wave, third wave. You're talking about black feminists. You're talking about modern, contemporary feminists. Are you talking about queer theory? What are you talking about?
Well, if you want to be really confused, just look up the definition of critical theory in one of these critical theory dictionaries. I mean,
I absolutely agree. So
it goes a few pages. Go ahead.
What they will say is that critical theorists themselves will say that a hallmark of critical theory is that it's anti-essentialist. It's hard to boil down to a single set of definitions. And so, but because of that, it's like you can people argue, critical theorists argue about what is actually a critical theory. In Patricia Hill Collins' brand new book, Intersectionality as Critical Social Theory, she has a whole chapter or section entitled, What's Critical About Critical Social Theories? And she basically, at the end of the book, says, well, no one can really agree as to what it means to be a critical theory. So my point is, when people blast critical theory, you got to be careful, because people say, well, that's not really critical theory. What really is critical theory is this or that. So I like to say, fine, pick whatever term you want. So here's my next slide. Critical theory with capital letters, capital T, capital C, capital T, is sometimes used to denote what's called the Frankfurt School. A Frankfurt School is this band of philosophers and sociologists in the 20s and 30s in Germany. They moved to Columbia later in the US. But there are a few, Marcuse, Horkheimer, Adorno, that came up with these ideas that are known as critical theory. They coined the term. However, that was like 90 years ago. Since that time, critical theories have developed and proliferated. So critical theory nowadays, or what are called critical social theories, encompass entire disciplines. So queer theory, the entire field of queer theory, is known as a form of critical theory. Feminism, cultural studies, critical pedagogy, critical race theory, gender studies, these are all forms of critical social theory. So it's this incredibly nebulous and broad category. So
would you say there's something that, is there a theme that ties them together? I'm thinking of one, but you tell me, I want to hear what you think it is.
Okay, so what I would say, and again, this is based on my reading, and you can actually go back to Bradley Levinson's book, Beyond Critique, where he says this. He says it's very hard to define what makes a critical social theory critical, but he gives three sort of broad themes of these theories, and they basically relate to understanding power. How does power operate? How does power, and especially how does ideological power operate to normalize certain ideas, to make them common sense? And I would say that idea goes back to Karl Marx. That idea goes back to the Frankfurt School. And ever since then, I'd say that all of these critical social theories deal with how power works, and especially how the ideas we adopt subconsciously, without even just common sense ideas, that they create these power differentials between certain groups. That's very broad. And then the project of a critical theory is not just to describe culture and society, but to transform it. Their goal is not, this is Horkheimer again, the Frankfurt School, saying we don't just want to explain explain power, we want to transform power to make it more equal, make it more equitable, make it more egalitarian and democratic. So that's very broad. Now, but here's the thing. When I criticize critical theory, I'm not criticizing literally every critical theorist since 1920s. I think that's because they're so diverse, it's very hard. What I'm critiquing is the iteration or the version of critical theory that's becoming very popular in today's culture. So what I'll say is this. Here's a way to think about it. Look at this list of words here. Intersectionality. Can you guys see that, by the way? I don't have the slide showing up.
Yeah, thank you.
So here's a list of words. Intersectionality, white privilege, white fragility, colorblind racism, internalized oppression, lived experience. All of these words are being used all over the place. And in fact, they've gotten very popular. Just do a Google search. You can do like a Google trend. You'll see a spike in like 2015, 2010. These words suddenly became very popular. Now, they've been around, like you said, since the 80s and 90s.
Well, actually, some of them are fairly recent. White fragility, I think, is of recent coinage.
Is 2015, I believe. Robin DiAngelo. Yeah, or 2011 maybe.
Right, intersectionality, I think, is also
88, 89, Kimberly Crenshaw. That's right.
Okay.
Well, so next slide. Actually, you're anticipating me here. So we can ask now. Look, all of these terms, I think undeniably come from a field within critical theory. These are critical theory type words. Now, again, it's not like Horkheimer in the 1920s was talking about cis heteropatriarchy, but these terms are coming from somewhere. And in fact, they're coming from these authors, right? Kimberly Crenshaw coined intersectionality. Peggy McIntosh coined she popularized the phrase white privilege.
88.
Robin DiAngelo. Yes. So the point is, they're not coming from nowhere. They're coming from certain scholars. These scholars fit into a certain stream of critical theory. And now, if you want to call it, what do you want to call it? You want to call it, I think, what name do you want to give it? Do you want to call it contemporary critical theory? Okay, fine. That's what I use. Contemporary critical theory. These are all living authors. Most of these are living authors. You can call it so James Lindsay and Peter
Right,
Boghossian.
right.
These guys call it they call this again, these scholars and this sort of whatever you want to call it, this ideology, they call it grievance studies.
There it
Grievance
is.
studies, right? I've heard it referred to as intersectionality.
Sorry,
again, understood broadly, as an ideology. So you can use whatever term you want. Call it critical oppression theory. Call it. But I just am trying to focus on these ideas. What are these ideas? What is the framework being used by these scholars and others like them to understand the world? And I'm calling that contemporary critical theory. If you don't like that name, call it. I mean, I don't like cultural Marxism for various reasons we can go into, but pick an innocuous label. Non-pejorative. Yeah.
Well, when I think of you mentioned Lindsay Boghossian and
Peter Boghossian and James Lindsay, and Helen Pluckrose.
Helen Pluckrose. I'm going to show the Wikipedia page on the Grievance Studies Affairs, which is also referred to as Sokol Squared.
Yeah.
We all remember the Sokol. Most of us don't remember the Sokol scandal. Something about the hermeneutics of quantum something or other, and as soon as I saw it, you and I had a little brief discussion about quantum theory before, because that's your specialty, right?
Yeah.
And I love Star Trek, and I love the Heisenberg compensators that they have, and I love the whole that I have I can articulate the concepts. Doesn't mean I understand them very well, and I also I'm a biblical studies person, and I did my master's in that, and I understand hermeneutics. So when he put hermeneutics and quantum theory in the same title, I knew this had to be a joke right away. And sure enough, it was a hoax that he perpetrated. And now we have Lindsay Boghossian and
Pluckrose.
And Pluckrose they basically repeated it to show that nobody really learned anything. Not only did nobody really learn anything, but it's even worse now today. So you add their names, Lindsay Boghossian and Pluckrose, to the Heterodox Academy, to the Quillette Journal, which is Claire Lehmann. Is that her name?
Yeah, Claire Lehmann, I think. Yeah.
Lehmann. Okay, she's an Australian. The Heterodox Academy. Basically, these are all secularists.
Yeah.
These are all mostly, as far as I know, non-believers. Who are mostly atheists. Boghossian is a very emphatic atheist.
Yeah.
And I don't know. So, and Lindsay, I think
he's an atheist too. Yeah.
He's an atheist, but not as emphatic.
He's mellowed out.
He's mellowed a little bit, yeah, because they see. I think some of them see that we agree with them on this issue, and so they realize, hey, we need as many friends as we can get. The Evergreen College.
Brett Weinstein. Yeah.
I mean, that was like, if more people watched the video of what happened there in that fiasco, I think most Americans would be absolutely horrified that the idea that this could spread. It already really has spread in other ways, but the students literally took over the university or the college, and the administration let them.
Yeah.
They let the inmates run the asylum. I mean, normally students, I would not characterize as inmates in an asylum, but the way these people acted, I characterize it that way.
Speaking of inmates in the asylum, it's about time for us to take our one break that we're going to do this.
Yes, if you give me a second here, let me. We want to talk about a product that we have to have at least one commercial, right? At least. So we have our sponsor today, and they ask some really interesting questions. And we're still on there. Okay, have those boring family dinners become unbearably tedious? Do you wonder when someone will invent a board game that gives your life a real purpose? Do you want to be part of something bigger than yourself while remaining the center of your universe? Well, then we have just the thing you're looking for. Where's the Outrage? The game where the woke shall inherit the earth, unless, of course, they're white males. Where's the Outrage? In Where's the Outrage, there are no unfair inequality promoting dice. Rules for taking turns are very simple. Each player gets points for being in an oppressed group, and turns are taken in the order of the most points. Next, you choose a bankroller, also known as the game's George Soros. The George Soros distributes the game cards, and then the fun begins. You select game pieces. Each player chooses one and places it in the forward space, and then they go according to the most points that they have. In this case, we have a contestant named Briannold, who is African-American, Native American, non-binary, transgender, and former female. G gets to make the first move, and G decides to go to the Christian-owned bakery where G extracts a free lawyer's card and occupies the bakery property. And the fun is just beginning. Perhaps G wants to continue on to the just visiting the free speech zone where G can blow off those fascist white supremacists and their stupid free speech by grabbing an entitlement card. And if G ever gives up her turn, then maybe you'll get to play too. Where's the outrage? The game where the woke shall inherit the earth. You need to get it. It's just loads of fun. So, okay.
So there you have it. Now, that's actually pretty close to what we see going on today, isn't it?
Not that extreme. That was satire. But I think
it was satire, but
I think obviously, as you talked about the evergreen controversy and the situation there, if viewers are not familiar with that, and that was obviously satire and extreme, people say, well, that's a caricature of that's a caricature of what happens in most of society. But I do urge people to actually watch the videos of what actually happened at Evergreen. Mike Nana has a series of really excellent YouTube videos, a lot of just footage, not commentary, just footage.
Just watch it. It's not real. It doesn't look very edited. It looks mostly raw footage.
There are a number of other articles too. Actually, on my website, I have a page called Important Articles on Critical Theory that links to a number of articles, again, mostly from non-Christians, documenting what they don't always call it critical theory. They sometimes call it, applied postmodernism, or the terms differ. But documenting things that are happening at Oberlin, things happening at Yale, things happening at other places. And if you understand the framework of contemporary critical theory, it suddenly makes a lot more sense. It's not just college students acting strange. It really makes much more sense. It's a worldview. It's a way of looking at reality. And within that worldview, their behavior is not, it's actually righteous. So it's a good segue. Let me share another slide here. Let me go down here. So, what is it? Slide share. Here we go. Now, let me share with you these major sort of tenets or ideas of what I'm calling contemporary critical theory. That is the ideas of these authors, people like Robin DiAngelo, Eduardo Bonilla Silva, Patricia Hill Collins, and Peggy McIntosh. So there are just four. This is a summary. This isn't written in stone. They're just a summary or distillation of what these authors are teaching. And I'll give you a helpful slide in a second. But the first idea is something called the social binary. That is that society is divided into dominant oppressor groups and subordinate oppressed groups along axes of race, class, gender, sexuality, physical ability, immigration status, age, etc. The second premise is that we're oppressed not just by violence or force or coercion, but through ideologies, ideas. This goes back to Karl Marx, the Frankfurt School, this idea that ideas can be oppressive. That goes back even to them. The third premise is that lived experience gives subordinate, oppressed people special access to truth that is generally unavailable to oppressor groups. And then finally, premise 4 is that social justice means tearing down systems of oppression so that people can achieve a state of equity. And that's the sort of primary goal of critical theory. So if you think I'm making this up, again, Ron, you talked about how, well, no, but if I encourage skepticism from everyone, ask to see this primary sources. So if a picture's worth 1,000 words, well, here are some pictures here. Here's a picture. This is figure 5.1 from Sensoy and DiAngelo's Is Everyone Really Equal? And if you look here, they list different oppressed groups. They list the various forms of oppression: racism, classism, sexism, heterosexism, ableism, religious oppression, etc. And they break society into what? A minoritized or target group, and then dominant agent group, right? So you have a subordinate oppressed group and a dominant oppressor group, and there's an oppression associated with every form of identity: race, class, gender. I just said that. So when people say, well, you're caricaturing these ideas, well, I just look at this figure and I say, how else am I supposed to understand this figure? And in fact, you go back up, here's their commentary. They say for every social group, there is an opposite group. The primary groups that we name are primary groups, by the way. There's more, but race, class, gender, sexuality, etc. And then they talk about how oppression is about not just overt acts of violence or subordination, but also ideologies, discourses that are passed off as objective. So, here's a good example: critical race theory. Critical race theory is a subfield of this broad area of critical theory. Critical race theory, one of its hallmarks is criticizing the idea of a meritocracy, the idea that we live in more or less, not perfect, but a meritocracy where if you work hard and try hard, you'll succeed. Now, to be clear, I don't believe we live in a perfect meritocracy, and neither does the Bible. The Bible says, look, wicked people do wicked things and prevent good people and hardworking people from succeeding. That's always going to be true in a fallen world. But they would say, actually, they would go, so critical theorists don't just say, well, we live in a partially just and partially unjust world. They would actually go further and say that the idea of a meritocracy is itself oppressive because it's used to justify existing oppression. So if you look at someone and say, why didn't you succeed? And someone says to you, well, you didn't work hard. And in fact, you didn't work hard. And,
Right.
And that's, so they'll say, actually, that claim is itself oppressive. They won't say, well, is it true or not? They say, well, is it maybe they didn't work hard? They will say, no. The very idea of meritocracy is a disguised, it's a power play. It's a bid to show that people who deserve to be on top are on top. It's what's called a hegemonic discourse, a story being told by the oppressor, the ruling oppressor class, to justify their dominance. So we're saying something very different here. We're not saying,
Right.
I don't believe for a second that, oh, if you work hard and you try hard, you'll live the American dream. I don't believe that. People get sick. People are abused. People are treated unjustly. But I'm saying that you can't simply say that any appeal to merit, any appeal to objective standards of right and wrong is actually a power play that's produced to justify the ruling class's power. That's not true. Yeah.
So would it be true that in a how do I say this? Generally, those that work hard, save, advance themselves educationally, apply themselves in their occupations, careers, whatever they are going to tend to be more successful than those who do not. That would generally be true.
Yeah, I would say that's generally true. And in fact, there's data showing it's generally true, right?
Is it true for minorities?
To point that out, then you're saying the critical theorists go, that in itself is an oppressive view.
Well, they would say it's part of a hegemonic discourse. So they would say, so let me give an example that we'd agree with. Here we say, this is important. Critical theory doesn't get everything wrong. They actually have some important insights. We shouldn't dismiss it. So here's an example. Hegemonic power is a real thing. The example I give is of standards of beauty and sexuality in society. You know, I have 4 kids. I have 2 girls. Now, as they get older, they're young. They're 10, 9, 6, and 4 right now. But as they get older, I will have to work really hard, especially with my girls, to convince them that their worth does not depend on their external appearance or their sexuality, that their worth is God-given, and it doesn't matter how they look. Now, I'll have to work really hard to instill in them that biblical idea that real worth is more than just external. It's about who you are on the inside and about your identity before God. Now, why do I have to do that? And why do all Christian parents have to work really hard to say, do not believe that your worth is tied to your appearance? Because they're bombarded on an hourly basis with ideologies from Hollywood, from the media, from Madison Avenue, from advertising, from everywhere that says you are valuable because you look a certain way. Now, Christians should say that is hegemonic power. And Christians should work to subvert and deconstruct and say, wait a minute, that's a lie. The Bible says that, real beauty is not, it's not like, it's not what you look like on the outside, but the truest form of beauty is a woman who fears the Lord, or a man who fears the Lord. What real power is not crushing your enemies, but service, right? Real authority comes. So the point is, we shouldn't dismiss all ideas of hegemony as this made up Marxist garbage. We should say, well, they get some things right, but some things very wrong. And so in this case, I would say, in terms of the idea that if you work hard, on average, you'll be more successful in our society than if you don't work hard.
Right.
That is generally true. Yeah.
I think it would help if we define the term hegemony. It's from a Greek word that's used in the Bible, hegemon, which means leader or ruler, and it's come into our language to mean either leader or dominant party. So like okay, the dominant race in this country still at this point is the Caucasian race. If you agree with the term race, that it exists, people who are identified as white. So that it's not necessarily an evil thing, but beginning with really the Marxists in the middle of the century, hegemony began to take on very sinister overtones. Mao Zedong would talk about the hegemony of the United States. So whenever he did, it was always a bad thing. And so we see the word gradually taking on these sinister overtones until now. And it's really interesting that it really began with Marxists. So,
yeah, well, and actually, it goes back to the usage that's current among critical theorists goes back to Antonio Gramsci, was a neo-Marxist
right.
theorist.
The Italian under Mussolini.
Yeah. And so he would define it in terms of, other writers, the word hegemon goes back, like you said, a long ways. But the idea of hegemonic power and the ideas being dominant, that's what he's talking about. And another example, take race. So, race is, I think critical race theorists are right that race is a social construct. Ethnicity is a biblical category, right? You have people from different ethnicities and ancestry and stuff. But the idea of race, like, you think about it, it's quite odd. Like somehow, a white American has something innately in common with, like, a Russian living in Siberia because they're both white. It's like they're totally different ethnicities. Like they might have totally different. One might be a Muslim, might be a Christian, one might be rich, one might be poor. So the idea that whiteness is a coherent thing, I think critical race theorists are right. Well, that was kind of socially constructed. But what I think, talking about hegemony, here's the trigger example. Critical race theorists have redefined white supremacy. What it used to mean, if you look at the dictionary, it means like thinking the white race is the superior, and they're superior to all other races. They deserve to be on top of society, which is obviously completely unbiblical and evil, right? Because again, one, race is a social construct. Number two, all human beings are created in God's image and therefore equal in value and dignity, period. But they've redefined white supremacy to refer to this hegemonic power that whites have in our society. Now, here's the problem. Was white supremacy in that sense a real thing 200 years ago? And I would say abso-freaking-lutely. I mean, in 1819, you had people literally saying whites are superior to all other races, and they're just explicitly saying that the white race is this is crazy. Did you know that there's a huge scientific debate for a long time over whether or not the different races had different, they didn't all go back to Adam and Eve.
Right.
Yeah, they actually, this polygenesis theory was current among Jefferson's day. There were arguments over whether or not blacks and Asians actually had a different Adam because they're not even the same species as the noble white man. That's garbage.
But when you look at okay, just take East Asians for example. You find amazingly similar viewpoints among Japanese, Chinese, and so on regarding themselves as opposed to the rest of the world. In other words, this seems to be an inherently sinful attitude that is shared by multiple races. There you have racial or ethnic hierarchies. You have people who are considered at the bottom rung of, like, let's say, Latino groups, Asian groups, whatever, a pecking order, so to speak.
I mean, I'm half Indian, right? The caste system, right? It's like, so it's not unique to America. Right?
White people do not invent this. Right. This form of sin.
So the idea of race, you could argue, was sort of a European invention, but the point is, like, race is not just one form, one manifestation of this sinful desire to put your own group at the top, whether it's whites or the Brahmins or the Japanese or whatever. Even if we got rid of race as a category for oppression, we'd find something else.
even in English culture, my wife and I are watching a series now called Poldark,
Oh
which
yeah,
really
yeah.
emphasizes this, where you have kind of the evil character is a guy who's the grandson of a blacksmith,
Mhm.
and he's trying to be accepted into society,
Yeah,
and he's feeling like he's not accepted because he's the grandson of a blacksmith and therefore looked down upon by the
the
more
elite.
elite,
Yeah,
right, group. And so and the hero doesn't like all this class nonsense.
yeah.
Uh, so this isn't new, and it isn't relegated to skin color.
Right. Well, that's why critical theorists would point to classism, sexism, and other forms of that. But and here's the okay. Let me just go through the different tenets first, and then we'll go back to why they're a problem. Because often the worst part is that they often contain an element of truth. Like we just said, there is real racism, there
Mhm.
is real sexism, there is real
Right.
classism. But so we shouldn't deny that. But we have to ask, well, what do you mean by those words? And so let me just go through some of the other the first one was the social binary that exists between oppressed groups and oppressors. So here's one figure. Here's another one from Adams and her co-authors from Teaching for Diversity and Social Justice, Appendix C. Same matrix of oppression, right? You have these groups broken down as oppressor groups and oppressed groups. But let me go to next one. 2 is that hegemonic power. So how do people oppress? And it's not just through violence and coercion, it's through their ideology being imposed on other people. Now, this is where it's okay. I mean, there's a lot here. Let me just go through the other premises first. So again, ideologies are oppressive. Saying things are normal and other things are abnormal. Some things are the default, other things are exotic. That is a form of oppression. Here's premise 3. And this is why. So you ask, well, wait a minute here. You always hear old white men. You guys are old white men, right? You guys are
I am for
I,
sure.
I'm,
Yeah.
I'm not old. I don't know about you guys.
I'm definitely old. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Well, here's a funny question, right? You say, well, old white men are like the canonical oppressor group, right? I mean, you kind of hear that in society. But if you look at the actual demographics, only about 1/6 of our population are old white men. And in fact, maybe, what, 2% of the US are rich old white men. So wait a minute, they're actually a minority, a huge minority. And why are they oppressors? And the answer is it's not about numbers, it's about hegemonic power. That critical theorists would argue who sets up the norms by which everyone's judged, right? The old rich white men. That is why they are viewed as an oppressor group, even though they're a huge minority, because they have not just any kind of power, but specifically hegemonic power, power to set norms.
Okay. So
Yeah.
let me interrupt because now I have a question.
Yeah.
Would that mean
I know where you're
that
going
the
down.
current LGBTQA plus whatever is the current oppressor group because they are the ones who are setting the norms for everyone else?
So this gets really interesting, okay, really quickly.
Yeah.
I'd say that one thing, so that's one thing you could point out, is that you'd say, well, wait a minute. So how would they respond? Isn't it true that LGBTQ plus groups are setting the norms by which increasingly our culture is being judged and dominated, right?
Mm-hmm.
What they would respond is that we are, this is getting tricky, we have been so saturated in the cis heteropatriarchy, the dominance of cisgendered heterosexual white males for so long that we have to that historically, this is why actually you'll see on a lot of applications and resumes and things, historically oppressed groups have a special status. So what they would say is 2 things. One is that subconsciously, as long as we still just naturally gravitate towards the binary of men and women, we gravitate towards, you look at, heterosexuals in the media and advertising, until we see it just as normal everywhere to see LGBTQ plus people on every level of society, and it's completely normal, only then will the oppression be ended. But even then, they'll still have historic oppressions. They would still be a historically oppressed group. So,
Okay.
yeah.
So let's pause right there.
Yeah.
What you just said, let's just take that and I don't know what to call it, but let's just can you call it what you just said, an ideology?
What, the idea that oppression includes hegemonic power?
All of the above.
Yeah.
If it's an ideology, is it, do they consider it the normative view?
So that's the key question. So I would say they do, and that's the glaring contradiction in their worldview. Now, here's the thing again. They would, so if you go back to the actual the postmodernists like Foucault would not say you shouldn't have ideologies. He has no, or narratives. He would have no problem with meta narratives or ideologies. What Foucault would claim is you can't have an absolutizing normative ideology. So in principle, what they could say is we don't want to have LGBTQ plus affirmation be the only ideology in society. We want it to be one of many.
Like, for instance, Nazism?
Okay, now okay. So now keep in mind, now here's the thing. You're approaching this as sort of from a more analytic perspective.
Oh, okay.
Critical theory is sort of part of, well, I would say part of, but it's much more related to continental philosophy. So there are indeed a lot of internal contradictions, but they would not see that as they would see. I gotta show you a quote. Read this quote, Ron, and the idea that objectivity is best reached only. Oh, sorry. Am I showing? Can you see this, guys?
Yeah, now I can. Go ahead.
This is from Collins and Anderson's. This is a really important anthology, Race, Class, and Gender. In their introduction, they write, the idea that objectivity is best reached only through rational thought is a specifically Western and masculine way of thinking, one that we will challenge throughout this book.
So how do we know that this is a specifically Western and masculine way of thinking? I mean, do they document the fact that women don't think the way men do? Do they that they don't think analytically? Because I've met a few women who think pretty analytically.
Sure, right. But now what they would say here, again, this is, if you read these books, it is incredible how little data or even argumentation there is. There are just these assertions like this one. I mean, really, is it masculine to think that objectivity is best reached through rational thought? Like I said, my wife's pretty emphatic that she thinks rationality is the best and only way to really achieve objectivity. But they'll make assertions like this. They'll make assertions about all kinds of just empirical claims with not a shred of empirical evidence.
Because it's about their normative ideology. It's not about.
It's a worldview. It really is a worldview.
They believe in truth over facts. That's
okay. I need to interrupt here a second. And I love this free flow, by the way. A couple of things. One, you should give out your website so that people can go there and start reading your articles.
So my website is just, if you Google Neil Shenvi, NeilShenvi, you'll find my website. And it has, I've reviewed like 30 or so books on critical theory pretty extensively. I mean, tens of thousands of words of quotes from these books. And so you can kind of see the documentation for the claims I'm making here.
Okay. So, and I would say, and if you're really new to this, Google Neil Shenvi, Critical Theory and Christianity. That'll take you right to his site. And he's got 4 articles, which are really helpful to get you started on that. So that's important. Second, we are not going to be able to finish everything we really should do. So I'm going to ask you if you will consider coming back at a future time to kind of pick this up, because it's influencing large amounts, not only of culture, but of the church, who tend to be uninformed because they're not asking definitional questions. What do you mean by this? Which then leads me to my next thing. Being that we deal primarily with cults and non-Christian religions, we're a mission to cults and non-Christian religions. I advocate for going and spending time with Wiccans and Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormons, see them as people, talk to them, figure out what it is that they're actually saying as individuals and what is the group teaching them, because this kind of falls in the same sort of thing. You have a worldview, you have doctrines that we need to understand if we're actually going to reach out in a meaningful way with the Word of God to impact them. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Now, back to your free-for-all.
Free for
Well,
all.
let me just, since we're finishing up, let me just put the last two
Yeah, please.
two slides. There we go. Okay, so so the premise, this is premise 3. So we said that, okay, you have a social binary of oppressors and oppressed. You have oppression not just through violence, but through hegemonic power, ideologies that are they're presented as objective, but they're only there to bolster the power of oppressor groups. Number 3, well, how do we see through these false ideologies, these hegemonic discourses? The answer is through lived experience. So oppressed people can have the opportunity to see that, oh my gosh, I'm being oppressed. It's not true that men or whites or heterosexuals are normal and they're the default. They're what we should aspire to be. Actually, that's a lie. I can achieve what's called a liberatory consciousness. I can, in the common parlance, get woke to the reality of these oppressions. Okay. Now again, here's the tricky thing: is it if someone is teaching, if someone believes that white is right and being white is normal and being non-white is abnormal, and that whites are superior to blacks and Asian and Hispanics, if that actually is being believed, Christians should absolutely see through that and say, no, biblically speaking, that is totally wrong. We're all made in the guts. So that, we'd say, is an example. And again, do people really actually believe that whites are, the master race?
Some people do still to this day.
Yeah. But is that normal in culture? Now, again, critical theorists would say it's absolutely normal. I would question whether or not exactly how normal that is. Like, I can't speak for all evangelicals. I've been a Christian for 20 years or so. I have never been part of a church that was not completely would just repudiate any notion of white supremacy or white superiority. My 2 campus pastors, one's Asian and one's black. I love them to death. They're awesome, and all of our members are just full-throatedly opposed to racism. So, are they just subconsciously white supremacists? I don't think so.
I have a story now. What I tell occasionally I'll talk to a minority Christian. I try to limit these conversations to Christians because we at least have something in common, I hope. And I say, look, they go, well, what can we do to convince you that white supremacy is an all-pervasive thing? And I said, tell me your story. You tell me your lived experience. And then I will listen, and I might not agree that this is happening everywhere, but if you are being oppressed and you are my brother in Christ, I care about that. I want to do something about that. I want to speak out against that. And if there's anything I can do to help you, I will do it. If I can be your advocate, I will. Now, I have heard credible stories using this method. I have, and even sometimes from non-Christians. So, but it always gets back to this: does this one story, do these anecdotes, which are very powerful many times, they're very compelling stories, and they really anger me many times when I hear them. Is this a case of one person going rogue? Or is it the way everything works? Now, I can understand why.
There is a third option. Sometimes it is racism. Sometimes, though, let's say someone goes into a store, because I've seen this happen, and they pick up whatever it is they want to purchase, and they go to the register, and whoever's at the register does not immediately serve them. Now, is it because they are of a different ethnic group? Is it because the individual is distracted with something else that's going on at the time? Is it that they've suffered loss in their family and they don't know? I mean, there's other reasons why they may not have been as attentive as you would have wanted them to be, unrelated to ethnic differences.
Yeah, and then there are just bona fide stories of racial profiling going on where you've got 5 or 10 people in a store. One of them is black, and that's who all the security people watch.
Right, exactly.
Okay, and I've heard that. I mean, now, and from very credible, Christians. Now, here's the question that I come to, and that is, let's just say, for the sake of argument, that there are a lot of white racists in the system, in the legal system, in the law enforcement system. Let's just say there are a lot of them. Does that mean systemic racism exists, because if you make that jump, what you're doing is you're basically redefining what we mean by systemic, because systemic means the system itself is designed to be racist. Now, there are people who will say that. There are people who will affirm that thesis. The system itself is designed to be racist. I'm sorry, I see evidence that there are racists in the system.
Yeah.
But I see a system that is actually designed to be anti-racist. I see a system that punishes racism when it is discovered, when it is disclosed. So that, I'm sorry, that's an obfuscation of terms that is unhelpful. In fact, that is actually divisive, counterproductive, and destructive when you do that.
And again, the definition of terms is key here, because they would say that and again, I have absolutely heard examples of racism and genuine white supremacy. You see, there's plenty out there, right? And they're terrifying and horrible. And like I said, I think you're exactly right. Tell me your experience, and how can I, as your brother in Christ, what can I do to help you and to assure you that I love you and that this is wicked, that I will stand up for you whenever I get a chance to. So saying that, but in terms of the white supremacy, the point I was making here is that because it's taken on this very broad meaning now, it means everything from literal Klansmen, right, to if you look at Peggy McIntosh's original paper on white privilege, she would list having Band-Aids that don't match your skin tone as white privilege. And that would all be along the spectrum of white supremacy.
Yeah, I can go into a room and I can be the first one. I can walk into a room and pretty much assured that I'm not the only person who looks like me in the room.
Right.
Okay. Well, that's what Jordan Peterson calls majority privilege.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's exactly right. So because it's taken on this hugely broad definition now, but here's the point. The point is this. Let's say that you could establish, let's just hypothetically say, you could establish that white supremacy was pervasive, in society, that, let's just say that, okay? One of the issues here, even if you could establish that, you'd say, well, that is actually wicked, because the Bible says that no racial group or any kind of group is superior to any other group, right? We're all equal in God's image. Okay. The problem is critical theorists will define not just racism and sexism, but heterosexism and cisgender privilege and heteronormativity and adultism and all these things. They're all forms of oppression. And there are no critical theorists out there writing today, at least among these scholars, I should say, these contemporary critical theorists. They do not see them on different footings. They're qualitatively the same. So, for example, Ibram X. Kendi, who's an African-American studies scholar, very famous, in his recent book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, he says you cannot be an anti-racist and be a homophobe. You cannot be anti-trans and be anti-racist. You cannot be sexist and be anti-racist. And by those terms, he doesn't mean, homophobia doesn't mean hating homosexuals, I get it, we shouldn't do, but it means in any way failing to affirm and endorse homosexuality in any way.
So what does it mean?
They're all tied together.
What does it mean that on the one hand, you can't be racist if you're black? On the other hand, you can't be homophobic without being racist.
Interestingly,
and on the third hand, Pete Buttigieg has practically zero African-American support in South Carolina because he's gay. What does all this mean?
So the funny thing is, Kendi, this is so funny. So Kendi does not, in his book, this is fascinating. In his recent book, he says the idea that blacks can't be racist is itself racist. That is a false and disempowering and reactionary redefinition of the term. And Kendi's like the funny thing is, when Christians are like, we have to just accept what this common grace wisdom that these sociologists are giving to us, and I say, wait a minute, they don't even agree. Like Kendi and D'Angelo totally disagree. Tatum and D'Angelo disagree.
So what about critical thinking privilege? What if I go and enroll in a college where that is the dominant, the hegemonic discourse, where it is the hegemonic ideology, and now am I not being oppressed by critical theory privilege?
Well, so the funny thing is, gosh, I could go on and on here. So you said you're being too analytical.
Oh,
that's not how. So, for example, here's a.
So how about non-analytical privilege?
I kid you not. So in Patricia Collins here. So Collins is on the right in this picture. Patricia Hill Collins' new book, it came out like 3 months ago. She says that a key part of any critical theory is it's called reflexivity. Now, what she interprets that to mean is that you have to evaluate your theories in terms of whether or not they promote social justice. If your theories don't promote social justice, which she does not define and which she says is hard to define, but if they don't promote social justice, then your theories have to be re-examined.
This is exactly what Marx, Lenin, Mao would all say. If there's a problem with, if you have any problem with the theory, the problem's with you.
And that's what, again, Robin DiAngelo in White Fragility says, if you balk at being called a racist as a white person, it's because you're fragile. And you need to just sit with your white guilt and realize you are, in fact, racist. And if you deny again, it's because you're being fragile. So it's called a Kafka trap, this idea that if you deny that you're guilty, it's evidence you're guilty. And so the only thing you can do is plead guilty, because then you admit you're guilty.
And there are certain cultures, I will not name them, where sociologists have already identified this years before this ever happened, where it is a cultural attitude that denial of guilt is evidence of guilt. It was already there in some of these minority cultures in our country.
Well, you know what's interesting, the funny thing is, you talk about minority cultures. This goes okay. Let's go to the next one, really, because we're going to have to finish up. I don't think it's minority cultures actually, because critical theory is being, and interesting, if you look at the pictures here, there are a lot of old white men, right?
Yeah,
Here's Horkheimer, right? So I don't think we should see this in terms of, ethnic.
Ultimately, you're right. I wouldn't say, I'm just saying there was a receptive audience for this idea. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah. And actually, interestingly, the idea of collective guilt is actually a war crime, according to the UN. Do you know that? I looked it up recently because I was surprised, but the idea of collective punishment, collective guilt is actually a war crime. Anyway, the last one, so premise 3 is that lived experience giving you access to the truth. So you can say, here's a good figure here. If you are an oppressor group, member of oppressor group, you have privilege, and that privilege blinds you to the truth. So you just can't know. I mean, you can know certain things, but not immediately, not as easily as oppressed people. If you're an oppressed person, then you have what's called internalized oppression naturally. So you are also indoctrinated into this hegemonic narrative, like whiteness is good, maleness is good, heterosexuality is good and normal. So you potentially also have internalized that narrative. However, because of your lived experience, you can possibly achieve what's called a liberatory consciousness. You can wake up and see that, take off the blinders and see the truth. Now, of course, privileged people can also achieve this consciousness. They can get woke too, but they have to do so by deferring to the oppressed group and letting them lead the way and show them how the reality actually works. So this is what's called being an ally. And you can't be a self-appointed ally. You have to be told by an oppressor group that, yes, you are standing in solidarity with us, and therefore you're accepting our testimony, and therefore you can achieve this, sort of in-group status. Okay, and finally,
that explains a lot. Keep going.
Well, then here's a good example. Pro-life activism. If you're a man and you say abortion is wrong and give rational arguments, one thing you'll meet with is, well, look, you're a man. Of course, you'd say that because you're just part of the dominant oppressor group. You're trying to subjugate women. This is an example of how this reasoning plays out very commonly. An example that we're probably familiar with. So, and lastly,
hold your thought. This is important to me. If you now identify you're biologically male, but identify as a female, can you have an opinion on this issue?
So actually, see, guys, listen. You think you're catching people, but they thought of this. So the term that sometimes is preferred in these discussions is a uterus haver. A uterus haver. So if you're a uterus haver, so if you have a uterus, then you can have an opinion. So they see the conflict there, but then they'll get around that by saying, well, if you don't have if you get to the slide, no uterus, no opinion. So they'll even go say you can't. So if you don't have a uterus, but here's the thing. What if you have a uterus? What if my wife says, I have 4 kids and a uterus? So can I give you an argument that abortion is immoral? Well, they will accuse her of having internalized oppression.
Right.
She's internalized the norms of the patriarchy, and because of that, she's just parroting their talking points.
So what if a woman with a hysterectomy is pro-choice? Does she get an opinion?
Yes, because she's acting as an ally. Right, so she has a liberated view. She has rejected the patriarchy's norms and is now She has a state where she can see how the oppression works.
Two things. One, they make the rules so they always win, right? And number two, you're a PhD. You're a PhD in theoretical chemistry, which of course, right there we got so much analytical stuff going on. You're obviously your head's all messed up. But looking at it just from your point of view, just for the sake of argument here, a theory is an explanation, okay? Right. And what you do with that theory is that you come up with testable hypotheses to see if the theory is correct. A theory should make predictions that you can form testable hypotheses, which in turn have their built-in predictions for how the hypothesis will play out. Has critical theory provided us with any testable hypotheses?
I mean, it's so broad. I can't say that broadly, but like I said, I would say that in reading all of these books, I have just been astonished at how often they'll make empirical claims about all kinds of, and just not have data. Like, in fact, and a good example actually would be this is again a portion of critical theory, but if you look at some, not all, but some modern feminists talking about things like the gender pay gap. There's a lot of actual empirical data that suggests that at the very least, the bulk of the gender pay gap is explicable through completely non
right. I mean,
it's choice. It's
choice. Just listen to Jordan Peterson. He's got the statistics in his brain. He can cite them. Thomas Sowell, same person, same thing.
And not just even feminists. Some other professing feminists will say, no, look, the data just shows that people are cheating. But here's the funny thing. Number one, oftentimes the sum of these feminists will not even just countenance the data because for various reasons. But the other thing they could say legitimately from their perspective, they could say, well, why are women making these choices? Because they have been indoctrinated into this male normative society. They are being told from birth they ought to be nurturing and caregiving. They ought to take care of their kids. And so even if you say, well, actually it's about choice, they'll say, but why was the choice was a conditioned choice, and they will not be truly free until this system of male dominance is overturned, which is why you have, again, feminists, not all feminists, but pushing to do things like create gender-neutral parenting and gender-neutral pronouns and gender-neutral colors in nurseries, because their theory is that the reason that women make these choices is downstream of the hegemonic power.
Do these people believe in evolution?
So actually,
you know where I'm going, don't you?
Yeah, because interestingly, well, here's the thing: you laugh, but again, this is why I keep saying this is a worldview.
Right.
It's and this is not pejorative. It's religion. I have a religion. I'm a Christian. Right. I have certain assumptions and presuppositions about how I view reality, and all of us actively fit the data into our framework. That's what's happening. Now, I'm not criticizing that. I do the same thing with Christianity. I fit the data into my Christian framework. Everyone does that with their own framework. But here's the key. I'm going to show, I guess, next time I talk to you guys, that these two frameworks are incompatible. You will either fit the data into a Christian framework or you will fit the data into a critical theory framework. You can't fit them into both. And so they're going to conflict unavoidably in numerous areas. So that's why you can't adopt both. They just won't work.
We have a situation where one worldview can be true and the other one false. Both worldviews can be false and something else true, but both worldviews cannot be true.
They directly contradict each other.
And to be clear, again, this is where people they're like, well, critical theory is not a worldview, it's just a discipline. But I'm like, okay, but the four ideas I've described, you don't want to call it critical theory, fine, call it something else. The four ideas, this is I'm on three, but the three ideas I've described so far, they are part of a way of viewing reality. They answer questions like, what is wrong with us? What's our problem? What should we do with our lives? What's our purpose? What's our identity? Who am I? Right? Who are my peers? Who's the in-group? Who's the out-group? Those are all worldview questions, and they're being answered by whatever you want to call these ideas. Last one.
Go ahead. Okay.
All right.
Social justice.
Put it up there.
You hear social justice a lot, and the critical theory, I'm not saying that everyone defines it this way, because clearly there are Christians who talk about social justice and mean something totally different. That's fine. But when you hear these scholars talking about social justice, they mean what it says right here. Social justice is the elimination of all forms of social oppression. What does that mean? Injustice based on a person's gender, race, ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, physical or mental ability. So the point is they have that matrix of oppression, the social binary. They have groups that are oppressed by hegemonic power, and they work to overturn that matrix of oppression, which means deconstructing the ideas that create this social hierarchy. That to them is how they define social justice. And I would argue that Christians must not accept that definition of social justice, because it's going to, I will go into that, I guess, next time. But that's, again, a key premise.
Leave us hanging there. Yeah.
Leave us hanging there. I feel like the guy is learning sword swallowing, and he's got it all the way down, and they say, next week, we'll show you how to withdraw.
Well, can I say one more thing, too?
Yes, please.
Before my goal in all of this stuff that I'm doing right now with critical theory is to convince people that are not like me. I am pretty concerned about critical theory. I'm very concerned about it. I really emphatically reject it as a worldview. But it's easy enough for me to speak to other people who are also conservative. They're also very suspicious of social justice. It's very easy for me to convince those people, I guess all of us, that social justice is of the devil. It's satanic, blah, 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 blah. It's evil. It's Marxist. That's easy. But I want to convince people who are either on the fence or who are actually sympathetic to critical theory, social justice, critical race theory, intersectionality. And what I want to say to you, if you're listening here, I'm not going to pretend I'm not a conservative. I can't do that. It'd be a lie. What I will say is I want you to hear that me, and I'm assuming both of you, Don and Ron, we also hate racism.
Yes.
We hate sexism. We hear people who are upset, who have experienced actual injustice, racism, sexism, horrible things. We know it exists. If you stick around for next week, you'll see an entire section that I give about modern day racial disparities.
Next time, not next week.
Next time, whatever. But we absolutely want to stand with you as believers in Christ to work for a more just society. Amen. Good. I am just saying to you that critical theory is not the way. It is, it is not the way. Not only is it not going to take you to this promised land of justice, it's going to, in ways and I want to sound paternalistic here. Let me put it this way. Personally, I have friends who have embraced these ideas. They've gotten woke, and they have shipwrecked their faith. I mean, shipwrecked it, becoming atheists. So that is why I'm concerned. If you listen to the whole talk and say, "Oh, I still disagree. I think it's all fine," that's fine. But I want to just encourage you to keep an open mind and know that we're not here. I'm not here to promote Trump in 2020. I'm not here to get you to vote for the Republican Party. I'm here to ask you, please, for Christ's sake, think about analyze, reflect on, critique these ideas that are pervasive in our society, and ask, are they biblical or not?
Right, from a biblical viewpoint.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I want to piggyback on that, and this will be short. To Christians, and which I had mentioned this earlier, is it is really easy to make fun, as we do with our little satire, of the beliefs of others. But it is really important when you meet someone or there are people in your family who hold these views, sit down and understand what it is that they're saying. Because there are points of agreement where you can agree. And then you can ask questions rather than making accusations to hopefully lead them to a place of going, well, maybe this is not true. If you just make assertions, they are in a fighting position. You're not going to get anywhere. So
absolutely. Okay.
And with that, we're going to ask Ron to walk us out of here.
Okay.
You and I will talk about another date. Ron?
All right. Our resident cult leader profiler is Neil before me. Our wardrobe manager is See How It Fits You. Our culinary services come from what happened. Okay.
There you are. You're back.
Okay, culinary services come from Chef Ham and Cheese. Our tinfoil hat provisioner is just in case. Our Jehovah's Witnesses coverage comes from Armageddon and D. Opposer. Our Mormon Archives manager is Polly Gummus. Our Liberal Denominations Bureau Chief is Lucy Goosey. Our transgender issues coverage comes from Ben Hur. Our special correspondent for cults based on the Hindenburg disaster and flying turkeys, Dehumanity. Our fact-checking supervisor is Yoleg Pulling. Our technical assistance comes through Murky Research. Our legal advisors are at the law firm of Dewey, Cheatham and Howe. Our grievance resolutions director is Giovanna Pisami. Director of Privacy Assurance is wiretapping, and our original idea sourcing comes from Drew A. Blank. The Unknown Webcast is a production of Midwest Christian Outreach Inc. in cooperation with Emergency Manicure Productions, both of whom are solely responsible for this content, although you will never be able to prove that in a court of law.
Never and never. And we've had that discussion before. So,
Yes.
All right, Neil, if you can hold on for a few minutes, we're going to end this. But next week, for those who watch us live, we have a debate between a Muslim and a Christian, both from South Africa, on who is God, Yahweh or Allah. So that'll be fun, and we're going to actually do this kind of satirical commercial free
next week. Yeah.
So
Hasta la vista, baby.
Hasta la vista, baby.